So I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Bhaskar Chakravorti from McKinsey & Company. Bhaskar believes that marketing strategies need to adapt with new innovations. He is the leader of the innovation practice at McKinsey & Company. Bhaskar is a professor at the Harvard Business School, and he's a published author. He's worked with the world's leading innovators, and he has given his time with us today to share his insight on the opportunities and challenges when bringing innovations to market in a connected world. Bhaskar?
Thank you. Thank you, Wayne.
Yep.
Is this mic working? Great. Thank you, Wayne, for this tremendous opportunity to speak to this amazing audience and for this opportunity to be at this amazing venue. Before I was coming down to New York from Boston, I was threatening to take my daughter's saxophone and just get one chance to play on the stage. And I have spared you that because my daughter told me that would be the lowest point in my career if I did that. But as it turned out, the highest point in my career was actually 12 years back. This was when I had written an article that was published in the Financial Times of London. And it turned out that it was one of the most well-remembered articles that year in the newspaper. And it also turned out that no one remembered what that article was about or who the author was. People remembered the article because it was accompanied by a photograph of the actress Demi Moore with the article. And everybody remembers Demi Moore in the Financial Times because she doesn't appear on those pages too frequently. Now, the reason why I happened to be associated with Demi Moore was I wrote about something called Demi Moore's Law, which was a bit of a takeoff on something called Moore's Law, which is, as several of you are familiar, with the basically the pace of motion or the mantra of motion, of innovation particularly, in the high-tech industry. And essentially, it comes from Gordon Moore, the founder of Intel, one of the founders of Intel, who said that the power of computing is going to double roughly every 18 months. And my point was that that might be a technologist's or an engineer's law, but really, from a marketer's standpoint, the ability of markets to absorb all this innovation, all this new technology, can happen much slower simply because there are many, many parts of an interconnected market that need to buy into whatever this new value proposition is. And when you add more nodes to that network, this process of adoption becomes slower and slower. And I said, as a simple rule of thumb, why don't you take Moore's Law and cut it in half in terms of the pace of adoption, and therefore Demi Moore's Law. Now, that worked pretty well, as it turned out, in the case of the high-tech world, because I was writing this in 1998, and 2 years later, the entire industry just went into a free fall. And it turned out that many of the great innovations at that time didn't quite take off, or it took many, many years more to connect. Now, healthcare is a different beast altogether, as all of you know much better than I do. And I believe healthcare runs on a different law. At least historically it did. And that law is Moore's Law. And by Moore's Law, it means basically healthcare marketers are trying to intervene on a bilateral conversation, primarily between a physician and a patient. And I just need to interject in there and tell them about my new product. And so the solution to that problem of how do I interject myself into this bilateral conversation is more. More knocks on the door, more feet on the street, more free lunches, if it's allowed, more odds and ends, pencils and so on, and more samples. But going forward, that world is changing. As we just heard in several of the discussions and presentations earlier today and this morning, that world is changing. Because the world of healthcare is going away from this bilateral paradigm and becoming more like other industries which are connected, which are interconnected, where the decision makers are tied into a whole bunch of other decision makers. So my choice is actually connected into the choices of several others. So I'm not just making a decision because it's good for me. I'm making a decision because it's good for N other people. And that's the new marketing challenge, which is the topic that I want to spend most of my time here today. Now, before we go into some of the principles that I'd just like to kind of structure this, this discussion on, let me give you a few faces of the new connected world of healthcare. And many of these faces, you may not know the individuals directly, but you probably are familiar with the stories. This is Diane Engelman and her daughter, Hillary Engelman. Her daughter, Hillary, has a condition called mitral valve prolapse. And she's had that condition for a long time. Got to a point where several cardiologists suggested to her that she should get immediate surgery to remedy the condition. Otherwise, she was looking at some fairly very, very serious serious problems ahead of her. And then they went through the whole process of trying to get permission from the network of physicians within the HMOs. She went from one physician to another, getting conflicting advice. So eventually, Diane reached out to her network, did a lot of research, and essentially became what they call an e-patient, an empowered patient, a patient who plays as much of a role in informing the decision that's ultimately made, as does the network of physicians. And I'm going to cut this long story short by basically kind of saying that what happened was the HMO surgeons continually resisted surgery for Hillary. And it was only because of Diane's empowerment through the connectivity into this network of other patients, network of other physicians, network of other source of information, that she could actually get the surgery done in a timely manner. And this is the kind of patient that we are increasingly going to be seeing in physicians' offices across the country. This is Amar Sani. He's an entrepreneur, he's an innovator in the medical devices area. He's riding a wave. He's riding a trend. And the trend is the trend towards minimally invasive surgery. And he's invented a core technology, which is a hydrogel. And what this hydrogel does is it's a platform technology from which he can spin off an almost endless stream of products. And these products are primarily useful for preventing tissue adhesion. They're useful for sealing surgical wounds. They're useful for separating tissues during surgery, or separating tissues when one part of the body needs to get exposed to radiation, another part of the body needs to be separated from it. So a variety of different uses in a variety of different parts of the body. And this guy has invented the core technology. And what he's been doing is he keeps the technology to himself, and he creates spin-off companies. Each one of the spin-off companies is aimed at a different part of the body, and eventually the hope is that those spin-off companies will be acquired by several of your organizations. So currently, one of the spin-off companies is owned by Covidian. A prior one is owned by Genzyme. In the future, there'll be, this technology will find its way into many, many different organizations. What we're looking at here is not a networked patient, but we're looking at a networked product that has found its way into multiple companies because it's coming from a core platform technology. This person is David Sinclair at the Harvard Medical School. He's got a technology which aims at another major trend, which is an aging demographic. An aging demographic that wants to continue to stay alive. So he is aiming at a series of enzymes called sirtuins, which are affiliated with the diseases of aging. And his objective is to use his core product to target several diseases such as type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, a variety of cancers, osteoporosis, and what have you, all associated with aging. And it has to do with activating sirtuins in the body. And this also, his product is a compound that's also found in red wine, by the way. But red wine, you simply can't drink enough red wine to be able to do what his product aims to do. Now, his product has found its way into GlaxoSmithKline. And currently, it's run into some challenges. However, the hope is that this core technology is going to become a platform for a variety of applications in a variety of different therapeutic areas. And there are several others. This is kind of created several other companies that are trying to go after the same set of issues that have to do with aging and addressing the needs of an aging population. Here again, we have a product that is networked in a very different way from the one that we just talked about before. Here's another denizen of the connected world of healthcare. This is Jonathan Bush. Now, Jonathan Bush always wanted to be a doctor growing up, and when his uncle, George Herbert Walker Bush, announced a desert storm in Kuwait, he signed up as a medic, but he never saw action. He never became a doctor. Eventually, he opened an obstetrics clinic with one of his friends, and it turned out, and his purpose was to open a clinic and apply some innovative healthcare practices. It turned out that they did extremely well. The revenues were going, in this direction, but they had no cash. It turned out that they couldn't make payroll. They couldn't make payroll because the whole process of getting reimbursed, that process was slowing them down. The whole process was broken. So what he realized was the real problem in healthcare, of course there are many problems in healthcare, one of the real problems in healthcare is that the healthcare system itself is not informationally enabled. So instead of a clinical practice, he decided to solve the information problem. So he realized that there are many problems at the pre-encounter, the patient encounter stage, and at the post-patient encounter stage. And for each one of these problems, he comes up with a product which is essentially a web-enabled delivery of an IT solution to the breakdown in information connectivity. And he's the founder of a company called Athena Health, which is going after this space. Finally, my last member of the connected world is a gentleman by the name of Cameron Powell. Cameron is an obstetrician in San Antonio, Texas. In the old days, this is how Cameron used to see his patients. Nowadays, Cameron actually doesn't see patients anymore because he founded the company that Dr. Topol just mentioned in his talk, Airstrip Technologies. And what they have done is they've created this ability for an obstetrician to be anywhere and yet have access to the waveforms, the critical waveforms of for the mother and of the fetus in the palm of the physician's hand. And we know that if you're in that practice area, you know that access to that information is one of the most critical pieces of information that a physician can have to essentially address some of the most significant problems that comes up in those practices. And he has been able to close the gap that traditionally was an Achilles heel in this practice. So as we can see, the notion of connectivity has spread in a number of different directions. It's spread in the direction of the patient is connected. As you can see, the physician is connected. And practically every single member in between and the products involved are connected in a variety of ways. So now let's sort of step back and think about our role as marketers. And how do we rethink the paradigm of trying to introduce new products into this community, how to fundamentally change decisions, how to intervene in the treatment choice and the brand choice and the various other choices that are involved, both from the perspective of patients and from the perspective of physicians and from the perspective of anybody else who's involved in the whole clinical process. Tom Lee, who's the president of the Partners Healthcare System up in Boston, he made the comment recently that in the last half of the 20th century, medicine went from pre-science to science, and this century, we're going to see delivery going from pre-science to science. And as you've heard over the course of today, we are indeed seeing the trends in that direction. And we're seeing that in a variety of different ways. We're seeing mobility and wireless connectivity and wearable healthcare. There's some of the most brilliant examples that Dr. Topol was talking about. IT-enabled healthcare, remote health, social media permeating into our decisions on healthcare-related conversations, the patient being empowered. From the perspective of physicians, they're beginning, some of the more enlightened practices are beginning to take more of a team-based approach to addressing a patient's need, as opposed to the physician being the single unitary hero who goes in and supposedly kind of knows it all. And then there are other changes in practices in terms of outcomes-based, evidence-based medicines, changes in the incentive structures, and of course the kind of the scientific discoveries around the corner, both from the perspective of personalized medicine and us becoming better informed about our underlying genetic structure. All of this is going to create, as we know, an incredible transformation in the delivery of healthcare. And hopefully the delivery of healthcare is going to stand up to the expectations that it's going to go from pre-science to science. But as we stand today, if we were to just take a snapshot of the critical participants in this healthcare chain, we see that these participants are overwhelmed with the amount of data, with the amount of information that's thrown at them. Another vignette. We don't see a fax machine in any other industry anymore, it seems, except in the doctor's office. It plays such an important role in their lives. Now, a typical day of a doctor's fax machine, 115 faxes, 55 lab results, 30 consult reports, 19 pharmacy renewals, 1 abnormal mammogram that needs immediate attention, which unfortunately often gets lost in the shuffle, 10 advertisements. If yours is one of those advertisements, it also is likely to get lost in the shuffle. On the other side of the coin, the patient screens, whether it's the screen that they hold in their hands or the screen on the desktop, is just littered. It's this explosion of stuff, some of which most of us don't even understand because it's at least 2 generations behind us. If it's your ad, if it's your message that's trying to find its way through this cloudburst, that's a huge challenge. So there's fragmentation in terms of attention of the constituents, and there's fragmentation of the constituents themselves. I try to understand what would be the process of a pharmaceutical product or a medical device product trying to make its way into the future connected world of healthcare. And one way to do that is to kind of look back and explore the experiences of products that have tried to penetrate the healthcare system and have had to deal with this connectivity challenge. And the kind of the real examples, only real examples we have are information technology products, which really do require the buy-in. It requires sort of multiple decision makers to weigh in. So just looking at the adoption of computerized prescription entry, and now, of course, with the the federal incentives, there's a greater incentive for adoption of CPOE. But historically, physicians didn't have those incentives. Right? And you can imagine that you can tell a story that ties together all the different participants of the chain of decision makers. You needed physicians, you needed insurers, you needed the pharmacies and the testing labs, you needed the hospital administration, you needed patients, you needed drug and device manufacturers, perhaps everybody to somehow participate in the decision-making process. And you could identify, what one can call a sort of an end game narrative of what would need to be true for each one of these parties for CPOE to become, if not universally adopted, but adopted by the majority. Now, to get to that endpoint, you have to make it compatible with the incentives of each one of these participants. Now, for each of these participants, it turns out that there are barriers to adoption, to getting to that endpoint, and there are motivators. And there are barriers and motivators for patients and for physicians. It turns out that there are barriers and motivators for every other party in this chain. So if you are a vendor who's trying to get CPOE penetrated into this market, you have to deal with this entire, this stereo equalizer of barriers and motivators and somehow tinker with all these incentives. And that fundamentally affects your marketing plan. It fundamentally affects your business model, because you have to then start sharing many aspects of your profits with several of the players in this value chain to make their incentives compatible with adoption. The only reason why I go through this little engineering exercise was kind of one test case of how difficult it is going to be for pharma and med devices going forward as we get into a more connected system, as we get away from that bilateral conversation and start intervening on this multilateral conversation. So really, going forward, a lot of the value for marketers is going to be, in addition to thinking differently about your product, you have to think about what is the equilibrium that you are trying to displace, and what is the new equilibrium that you're trying to create. Now, innovations, historically, when we studied highly interconnected markets, we find that innovations in highly interconnected markets have to deal with a fundamental equilibrium principle. I adopt something because I believe a whole bunch of other people are adopting it. So I go on a particular social networking site because I believe a whole bunch of other members of a community that I value are also on that site. If people are switching to a different site, then I will switch to that as well. So my behavior is very tightly tied into the behaviors of others. And this paradigm is very, very different from trying to have a one-on-one sale to a physician or a one-on-one pitch to a consumer. Now the second, so this is a barrier to adoption. A second challenge is that once you've got your product in place, you want your product to be the center of a new equilibrium. Because once you've got it in place, you can potentially create a network around it. And it makes it that much more difficult for the next competitor to come in and displace you. So that's the second aspect of the dynamic. So this can be reduced to a set of design principles for a marketer. And at a very conceptual level, the design principle involves that you have to, the moment you see a whole network, a whole fragmented body of decision makers, it's impossible to figure out, where do I begin? Who do I start with? And historically, the way we've seen this work is when you see a fragmented body of such decision makers, don't be intimidated by where do I start, but really go to the very end of the story. Try and tell the story of how this process might end and what you need to believe each one of the decision makers doing in a scenario where they have adopted your product. So imagine that end game. Understand who the constituents are. Who are the players? What are the pieces in that end game? And what are their incentives along the way so that they can help you get you there. Now, with a highly fragmented body of decision makers, you can't possibly throw your marketing resources against all of them. So you have to figure out where the centers of gravity are. And every network has some nodes where power aggregates. So look for those power players. And those power players will then help disseminate your message to others most effectively. Now, invariably, this is a nonlinear process. Invariably, this is not going to work with Moore's law. By knocking on the same door 100 times, historically, it actually worked. It better than, it is better to knock 100 times than knock 50 times. This way, in this new world, it's not going to work the same way because it's going to be highly nonlinear. So you have to be prepared to be wrong. To prepare to be wrong and figure out where you are completely firm in the commitment that you made up front in terms of your commitment of marketing dollars and where you're going to be flexible. Now, this dynamic of penetration of innovation in highly interconnected systems, it has a long history. It's just healthcare has just been different. It's even, despite the fact that we've had delays in the adoption of the stethoscope for 20 years or the adoption of even, the first clinical trial in history was the use of limes and oranges on British ships. And even after that was that first proof of concept had come that sucking on a lime actually helps prevent you from getting scurvy. For that to become a practice on ships took apparently even more than 50 years. So yes, adoption takes a long time in the healthcare profession, but when you look at other industries which are highly interconnected, where the choices are highly interconnected, adoption took even longer. The adoption of the typewriter took almost a generation. The adoption of a product like the Adobe Acrobat took a long time until Adobe figured. Now, if you think about the network problem of Adobe, you will convert your documents into an Adobe PDF if you believe that readers are going to be using an Adobe reader to read the document, right? So it becomes a self-reinforcing story. The people are going to read on Adobe if they believe that there are Adobe documents on the web. So, where do you start this chicken and egg problem? Now, the way Adobe overcame this chicken and egg dilemma was they found the power players. They piggyback on the Microsofts and the AOLs of the world to diffuse their product. And when they ran out of Microsoft and AOL's reach, they went to the most powerful player of them all. They went to the IRS. And for the first time, they realized that the IRS reaches more people than Microsoft and AOL, at least it did in those days. Probably still does. Certainly reaches more people than AOL does. For the first time, they had the IRS tax forms available on a PDF on the internet. And that was how Adobe caught fire. People just instantly recognized this as the new standard for reproducing documents in the original form. The Airbus A380, one of the most innovative airplanes, one of the biggest airplanes commercial airline has built. Well, once they had built this plane, they could put it up in the sky, but they didn't have any place to land it. Because guess what? None of the airports had been reconfigured to allow such a big plane to land. And that slows down adoption. And we have lots and lots and lots of examples of this, not the least of which being the iPhone. The iPhone has that kind of exponential characteristic that Mary Meeker was talking about in its adoption for several reasons, not just because it's a cool product, but it's got at least 150,000 apps sitting on top of it. So the iPhone has realized that there's an entire network that it brings along with it. So the iPhone itself is a power player, but it brings along an entire network of others, all of whose incentives are completely aligned with the success of the iPhone. And that's where the healthcare industry needs to go. Now, I just want to close with a quote from a gentleman by the name of John Seeley Brown, who used to head up an organization called Xerox PARC. Now, Xerox PARC was based very much along the same lines as the great pharmaceutical companies and the great medical device companies of today. They were the center, it was the center of innovation. Some of the world-changing products were developed at Xerox PARC, just like some of the world-changing products that developed at the great pharmaceutical citadels of today. But Xerox PARC did not win the game ultimately, because the future is not invented. The future is not invented by science. The future is co-evolved in collaboration with an entire network of other players. Xerox learned that lesson only very late. And several other players learned that lesson much earlier than they did. And every single application that we are talking about today, whether wireless or wired, at some point or the other traced back to an invention at Xerox PARC. And I think that's a lesson that the high-tech industry has learned. It's time for the healthcare industry to learn the same lesson. I want to close with a quote from an old client of mine who we were just starting a major marketing strategy engagement with this very large pharmaceutical company. And the client said that my problem is, and he was in charge of allocating resources for marketing across the entire organization. And he said, I know that 50% of all my marketing dollars are a complete waste of my money. My problem is I don't know which 50% it is. Now, going forward, it's actually 75% of marketing dollars is going to be a complete waste of money because of all these challenges. However, there's a new law, which I'm going to call the less is more law, which is that remaining 25% is going to be incredibly high quality. It's going to force quality. It's going to force innovation in marketing. It's going to force business model re-engineering. And whoever wins that game is going to come out a real winner. And you're not going to be knocking, it's not going to be a war of attrition on how many doors can I knock on, or how many feet on the street do I put, and how many, physician conferences can I organize. It is going to be how that limited set of resources and the limited attention span and the limited real estate on a handheld device. Who innovates on utilizing that constrained resource is going to be the winner. And if any of you are going to be that, then I think it's an incredibly sunny word for marketers going forward, because the rewards to being a marketing innovator are going to be tremendous. Thank you.